How many forms can entrepreneurial innovation take? We're going to learn about one today that you might not have considered. And it's generated a stream of customer value and unleashed hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue growth.
This is the Economics for Business podcast. We're here to help all businesses become champions for customers and value, improving lives with preferred and innovative products and services. We offer you the knowledge and tools to make your entrepreneurial journey a successful one. Now, here's your host, Hunter Hastings.
Hi, Hunter Hastings here. Value streams are generated by customers. They're the ones who value the products and services that firms provide. That customer-determined value becomes a revenue for the entrepreneur who designed and implemented the service. Where do these new products and services that create new value streams come from? We generally say the entrepreneurial process, identifying a customer problem to solve and designing a new and better solution. We're going to drill down one level further. First, into the problem. To get to the true knowledge of customer need, it's critical to sense the emotional need. It might be intense, a powerful value driver, but it's under the surface. How do you develop the deep empathy required to dig it out? And then, having done so, what's the nature of the innovative initiative that will capture the value of an emotional need? How do entrepreneurs embed emotional value into a commercial solution? We'll find out today from a master CEO who started a market-leading firm quite literally in his basement. He grew it to over $200 million in customer revenue. He identified the market drivers, and most importantly, he deeply understood the client's emotional stress and the innovation required to relieve it. Let's listen to Joe Matarese. He's founder and CEO at Medicus Healthcare Solutions and a leader in his industry. Let's find out how he got there. Joe, welcome to the Economics for Business podcast.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here.
Well, we're eager to learn from the real experiences of successful entrepreneurs, and you certainly are one. You've achieved success with your firm over an extended period of time in a field that's high in innovation and high in regulation. That's the healthcare business. Your firm is called Medicus Healthcare Solutions, and you've grown it from literally zero to, I think, over $200 million in revenues.
Yes.
Which, as we Austrians understand, is a measure in financial terms of the real value that you've created for customers. So we're looking forward to learning from you, Joe, and we like to learn about the journey and what your history was before you started Medicus, your background experience. How did you get to the brink of being an entrepreneur before you actually took the jump?
It's an interesting starting question because people always ask me, is entrepreneurship, is it a skill or is it innate? Are you born with it? And I think the answer truly is both. I think the skills are somewhat fungible. I think you do have to have skill, but you can learn the skill. The piece that is not so easily learned is this innate ability to understand risk and to have tolerance to be able to sleep at night knowing that you have capital in your business, your whole life savings in your business, and that the business actually can fail. As you know, in modern day world, there's profits and losses, and those losses can be significant and can be, your life savings perhaps. So I think people have to be comfortable with this idea that they can take risk, and it's calculated risk. And if they can do that, they can attain the skills, then they can certainly be an entrepreneur. So I think for me, I always had an entrepreneurial risk-taking mentality. I remember whether it was growing up as a really young person, trying to create little businesses. I can remember going back to fifth grade. I used to, when people forgot their lunch money, in fact, it was a dime. I used to have extra dimes, and I would give them the dime, and the next day they would give me 15 cents back. And so I would make, a nickel. And every couple of days I would make, the price of a whole lunch. And, I'd be whatever, I'd make 10, 15 cents a week. And, that was like in fifth or sixth grade. So I had this idea that, money was important, how to make it and how to create value. And that was a pretty good service. When I was in college, I started a painting company and started to paint houses for the summer and hired college kids and, had a business. And so that was sort of the background. I was formally educated at Boston College, and then I did my graduate work at University of Texas. So, I in 2000, the year 2000, I wrote a business plan, and it was a business plan that ultimately was the Medicus business plan. And I remember the professor, I got a B on it, and he said, "This is very good." He says, "But it's too complicated and too detailed for the purposes of the class." It was like 75 pages. And I had all kinds of, because it was real. So I wasn't doing it academically for the sake of the grade. I was doing it really in my life because I believed in this concept. And so in 2000, I wrote the business plan, this Medicus business plan. And the genesis of it really was I was already working and I was going to school simultaneously. And the job I was doing during the day was I was in IT staffing for a company in Massachusetts. And you can remember back in 2000, the stock market and the market in general sort of crashed, and it was really driven by the NASDAQ crash and really technology, the dot-com bubble and bubble that ultimately burst. And so we were in IT and software, and it became clear, I was on the strategic team there, and it became clear that there was some rocky roads. And this is where the Austrians are very good. The market didn't make sense to me in terms of the way the prices were moving up. They were moving up at a much greater rate than what was being produced, and in terms of matching the labor. The labor costs were going up dramatically. It was very expensive. And these projects there was a lot of malinvestment going on in these projects. And so we saw layoffs all around the industry. We knew it eventually was going to impact us. And it really did. Our company was 225 million, 230 million, like in 1999. And by 2001, we were down to like under 100 million. So it was a huge crash. And it wasn't surprising to me. The market was telling us that this was going to happen. So as part of strategy, I said, we need to diversify. And I convinced the owner of the company that we should get into healthcare. And so over the next 4 years, I developed a company that got into healthcare for them. And as we progressed down the line, it became clear that the company, my vision of what we can do in the market wasn't going to be their vision, what they could do in the market, primarily because they were a software staffing company. And so this was a little small division. So I exited out of there and I got that business plan that I developed, in 2000. And I really spent quite a bit of time enhancing it and trying to understand how I can create value in the marketplace. And really what I realized is that staffing in healthcare was not very innovative at the time, and it was behind IT and other staffing industries that staffing supported. And so I realized that some of the things that I learned on the IT side, I can apply on the medical staffing side. And that was really the foundation of how Medicus got started. And almost immediately in 2004, that first year was very, very good. We generated like $3 million in revenue. And within 18 months, we were the largest provider of temporary doctors in radiology in the state of Florida. So by the end of the second year, we were doing 10 million of revenue. And by the third year, we were doing 20 million in revenue. So the reason we were able to do that is staffing was already around. There were already competitors. This was an industry that started in the late 70s. So by the time I got in, it was 30 years. The industry had a 30-year head start. But we gained traction because of the innovation. We really try to innovate the services relative to what was already offered. And the way we recognized that was just really, and this is simple, listening to the clients. What were the clients really telling us? And what they were telling us was that they didn't have a great relationship with their staffing providers because there wasn't very much accountability. And we delved into that. We said, well, tell us more about what you mean by accountability. And really what it was the staffing companies, the basis of competition primarily was speed. And they were trying to provide or find doctors for these clients, but they really weren't vetting the clients. They weren't vetting the doctors out based on preferences, and they weren't really locking the doctors in contractually. And so as a result of this, the quality sometimes wasn't very good, and sometimes the doctors wouldn't show up. It was absolutely astounding to me. I remember talking to a woman, it ended up being one of my big clients. It was on a Thursday, and she said, I need help for Monday. I said, Monday, meaning like 3 days from now, 4 days from now? She's like, yeah. I says, well, what happened? She said, well, we had somebody planned, but the company just called me and said that the person's not going to show up. And I was astounded. As you can imagine, do they not have a contract? Did you not have a contract with the agency? Did the agency not have a contract with the doctor? So all of these questions, and she didn't really have good answers for them.
I just wanted to ask you a question about that, because I remember something you said to me once, that you've identified this problem in the service, contractual problems and functional problems. The doctors didn't show up. But you also said the client was stressing out about this, which captured for me this idea of the emotional benefit to the client as well as the functional benefit to the client.
No doubt about it. She was the manager of the radiology department, and she was a clinician. She was managing radiology techs. She herself was a tech. So, from her perspective, it was all about patient care. So for her to have this on her plate and stress out that she may not have enough radiologists to read films in an active practice, the hospital was getting 200 or 300 cases a day. It was her responsibility not only to be able to do the technical piece of it, of putting people in the MRI machine and pressing all the right buttons. She also had to make sure that those films were going to be read by having a cadre of doctors on site to be able to read those. So when she was telling me this on the Thursday, I mean, she was an emotional wreck because it fell on her responsibility. And it's great. It's greater than just you and I who happen to get sick and we call in for one day. This is serious because if you can't get doctors to read cases, people can die. I mean, there are emergent cases where have to get read immediately because it's an emergency situation. So doctors are one of the few professions where, you have to make sure that you have coverage for yourself. You just can't not show up. I mean, could you imagine going to the hospital and not having enough physicians where they can't run the OR or they can't run the ER? So it's very, very serious. She wasn't in good sorts. I had promised her. I had a meeting with my delivery team. They assured me that we can get people there on Monday. The question was credentialing. What the client said was we can emergency credential them. So if we found the doctor, we can get somebody there for Monday. We did it. What that led to, though, is a deeper discussion that I had with her in organizing her schedule far in advance. And I said that I would take that responsibility to do that for her. And I would send it to her every Friday, and then she can look at it and see who the doctors were. But I would make sure that I had the schedule filled. We would have her set of doctors that were permanent to the hospital, and then whatever gaps we would fill in as the agency support. So we did that, and she loved the idea. Of course, she's a clinician. So this idea of taking that administrative work away from her was a home run. The thing that was so surprising is that was revolutionary. So here's an industry that's been around for 30 years, and this is the first that people are hearing of this. So this took the industry by storm. And as a result of it, within 18 months, Medicus became the largest provider of locum services in the state of Florida, because of course that's what our focus was. We specialized in Florida in a very niche market. We did radiology and anesthesia, and we did it primarily in the state of Florida. And we built the business based on that idea.
So I just want to put a real spotlight on that, Joe. You're about to talk about innovation. I don't want to interrupt that, but taking responsibility. So that sounds like an innovation in itself. It's certainly a great service, but here's a responsibility that the client couldn't discharge because they didn't have the right systems. They weren't competent even. And you don't just solve the problem, but you relieve them of that burden of responsibility. I just want to drill down into that and what that felt like for you, because that's a tough thing to do, take that responsibility, and what it felt like for the client.
Well, I think if you take a step back, the fundamental problem with staffing historically has been the misalignment between the agency and the customer as it specifically relates to quality. The idea was, hey, let me just get somebody to you, and here's Joe Smith. Joe Smith can do the job. Well, could Joe Smith really do the job? And that was a real question mark. And so when you had temporary employees, albeit doctors or anyone else that works in the workforce, the quality has to be at a level that meets the expectation. And I think that staffing companies didn't have an alignment because they had no skin in the game. If once we made the assignment, we were billing the hours out, and so we were going to get paid whether they did lousy work or they did great work. What we're saying is, which was revolutionary, is no. We're responsible. We're going to make sure that person not only shows up, but they're going to be competent and capable to do the work, to meet your expectation. And in order to pull that off, you really have to understand and aggregate preferences. You have to understand what kind of environment that hospital has. So when you go to your inventory of doctors, you make sure that you get a match. It's usually almost always never a question of medical capability. Doctors are certainly capable. The question is, does that doctor fit into the environment that the hospital has, the culture, the volume, the type of patients, all of that stuff, right? So as an example, and there's a whole bunch of these examples, it could be just merely volume. If I have a doctor who's normally reading 80 to 100 cases a day, and I put him at a busy place that has 200 cases, that's not a good match for the client or for the doctor. Mm-hmm. If the client has 90% of 100% of the patients that are non-English speaking, and then you put a doctor in that doesn't speak English, that's not great. I mean, from a customer perspective, from a patient perspective, not great. So what we would like to do in that case is match a doctor up who has the same language that the patients are going to have. And if that happens, there's a better connection. There's less illustrations, less issues of communication breakdowns. They can communicate better. And so as a result, better experience. So these are the little nuances that's necessary to be successful in this kind of industry.
A quick note. Did you know that we provide supplemental materials for each podcast? Listening to and understanding the key takeaways from our expert guests helps you think better about building a more beautiful business. Taking direct action and implementing these strategies is when the real work begins. Take a concrete, immediate step to implementing a better business model today by downloading the show notes and business tool we've created for this episode. Visit Mises.org/E4Bpod. That's MISES.org/E4BPOD and click on today's episode. Now, back to our interview.
Yeah. Now, how do you do that, Joe? Do you build profiles of the doctors and the hospitals and match them? How do you physically go about it, or actually go about it?
That's exactly what you do. You use technology, but you have relationships. It's a relationship business. You work very carefully with the clients to understand what the client needs. And here's one of the things that's interesting because it's not as simple as what the client needs. It's also educating the client to the extent that what the client may need and what's available in the marketplace may not be a match. And so the question becomes, although you say that you need X, A, B, C, and D, do you really need A, B, C, and D? Is A, B, and C good enough? Because if you add D to the mix, that's going to either bring the price up beyond what you're budgeting for, or it may get to a point where there may not be enough market options for you to fulfill that opportunity. So it's an iterative process of educating the client to the extent that, because you know what the market is, whether it's market availability, pricing, etc. The client, we talk about consumer sovereignty and the customer's always right. Well, the customer is not always right. The customer sometimes has to be educated. They may think they know what they want, but and it may be true what they want, but if it doesn't exist, then in order for them to fill it and for us to move forward, there has to be some modifications.
Yeah. Yeah. So you're educating the market. You said that growth came. Was that internally driven by Medicus, by this revolutionary approach that you had, and it's driven internally, or is the market growing and you seized onto that? Can you sort out that kind of supply and demand question?
Okay, so the industry has a very good track record from a growth perspective. The industry now it's 40 something years old, and the industry has grown every single year with two exceptions. Last year, COVID, and in 2008, the financial crisis. And in both years, in 2008, the market was down about 0.3%. So essentially flat.
Flat, yeah.
The other year, COVID, it was down. We don't know the exact numbers, but it was going to be down. It's going to be down probably 3 to 5%. Every other year, the other 40 something years has been a positive outcome, a growth situation. So when Medicus's performance relative to that growth has always outpaced the industry. So we would outgrow the industry usually by multiples. We would really outpace the industry's growth. And I think the driver was innovation. I think that's the primary driver, was our ability to innovate, create solutions that were relatively straightforward, easy to administer, and not easy to administer from a business perspective, but easy for them. We made their lives easier, as the example we gave with the radiologist in that earlier example. Her life was a lot easier because we were managing the schedule. But in order for us to manage the schedule, it's a very complicated thing to do internally, which gave us further competitive advantage against the competition, because they can't easily replicate the things that we were doing.
Can you tell us about some of the specific innovations that you're thinking of, Joe?
Yeah, well, from a market perspective, I think scheduling and taking the responsibility was a big innovation. We also added consulting services to our repertoire. And the reason we did that was when a client has a need, sometimes they know they have a need. It's obvious. I'm running the OR next week. Based on my schedule, I need 4 doctors. I have 3 doctors, therefore I need 1 more. So that's pretty straightforward. But it's really more complicated than that. The question becomes, why do you need that 4th? The easy answer might be volume. But the question becomes, really, the next deeper question is, why do you still need the 4th? Why don't you already have that 4th on staff? And oftentimes they didn't know the answer. And so where we can consult, sometimes it's the consultant concluded that it's seasonal. I only need to carry 3 doctors, but we're a summertime resort area. So for the summer months, we need a 4th or 5th doctor. So we don't want to hire somebody permanently. So we want your doctor there for 60 days, right, to handle the seasonal rush. Perfectly makes sense. Other situations, they have a systemic problem where they have doctor turnover and they can't staff their ERs, their ORs, etc. And they don't know what the problem is. And so not only are we providing them the staff, but we're getting to the next level to say, let us come in, do some consulting to let us so we can understand why your staffing is so disjointed, or why you can't hire permanent people, or why you keep looking to us as a solution. Because we ourselves are not a permanent solution, we're a temporary solution. Now, if you're going to use us because a doctor went on maternity leave, that's a great way to use us. If you're going to use us because you're seasonal, that's a great way to use us. But if you're going to use us in perpetuity because you keep turning doctors over, that's an expensive proposition and not a good way to use us. So we wanted to solve that problem for the client. And we would come in, and oftentimes what our consultants would find is that the way that they managed their doctors was less than effective. So we were able to come in and make some recommendations. So that's one example. Another example of the innovation is what we call transitional management, where hospitals oftentimes may have a third party running their ER, staffing their ER, and they may want those doctors to be permanent so they can have more control over the schedule, more control over the doctor. But they just can't snap their fingers and make that transition. So we created a model where we would come in with our team of doctors, we would work 6 months, and in the meantime, we were setting up the infrastructure and we were hiring people permanently. So within 6 months, we can ease our way out of the hospital.
Yeah. Working yourself out of a job.
Yes.
Yeah, which is a benefit to the client.
And for the patients. And for the patients.
Yeah, good. So, Joe, your business is growing. You're learning. That's what you've been talking about. You get new information, and that becomes even more beneficial for the customer. You're changing. One of the big challenges that other CEOs have talked to us about is managing the firm, and especially the people and the organization, through that change, through that learning. And not all of them can stay at the same pace or can make the same strides. Can you paint that picture for us a little bit, managing people that are working for you in that situation?
Well, yes. And I would say that that's one of the biggest challenges. Fortunately for Medicus, as I mentioned earlier, we're in a growth industry. Industry grows every year, almost without a doubt. And having the wind at your back is really a nice thing. So we don't have this dynamic of fighting in a shrinking market. So with that said, the real challenge then is mostly internal. And when you talk about internal, it's mostly employees. The company is the employees. The cumulative work of what the employees do and how they interact and how they collaborate will decide whether the company will be successful or not. And it's a huge challenge. And let me just say it in this way. The company goes through stages of growth, and there's plenty of business authors who write about this, and they have Harvard Business Review's case studies about this. The issue is really profound, and I lived it in Medicus. When Medicus was in my basement with 3 or 4 other employees, that was a very, very engaging culture. We were all friends, and we knew we had a job to do, and we got it done. We were growing the company. As the company gets bigger, you then hire that first wave of employees and future managers. And at that point, they come in, and it's still relatively in a startup phase. And so there's a lot that they do day to day. There's a lot of hats that they wear. As the company gets bigger, their job gets more specialized. And this is the part that I think is the most challenging, and in some cases the most disappointing for me as an entrepreneur, as the CEO and entrepreneur of the company for the longest time, is that those people that joined you and took a chance believe that you can do it, and we did it together. Once the company got to about 50 million, that was really a change. And the people that got us there weren't the same people that were going to get us to the next level of 100 million. And I think the reason that's the case is that the company was growing at 30-40% a year, and the people weren't professionally growing at the same rate. And so they didn't possess the skills necessary that was necessary to get to the 100 million. And it really is disappointing because these are the people that believed in the company, and some of them really couldn't continue on. They didn't have the skills. They had to be replaced. And so we had to either exit them out, or they had to be repositioned within the company in a different role. And sometimes that's a role that maybe the ego didn't allow them to do, or they didn't think they were suited for, or they felt they might have been going backwards in their career.
Yeah, that sounds like a difficult management situation or management task, Joe. Could you got any advice about how to handle that?
I think that good communication, transparency, data is always important to be able to show people where they're at, how they're developing. And I think that be very clear as to the next position. In other words, when you have a manager that's going to get hired, you really compare and contrast that manager's background to the background that existed internally, and point out the differences experientially of why that person internally is not getting promoted up. We want to promote people internally. That's an ideal situation, but you can only do it to the extent that the people are going to be successful in their next role.
Mm-hmm. So often we talk about organizational design, and we tend to talk about highly decentralized organizations where you place a lot of the decision-making authority at the edge. Some organizations need to be more centralized with what the Austrians call rules after Hayek. What's your thinking about that? What have you learned about organizational design, or does it just emerge?
I think it emerges. I think it emerges really, and it's heuristic. I think that you always are making adjustments as you get feedback from the customers, from the employees, and you're getting feedback in what's working and not working. What's working, you exploit, you leverage, you build upon. The things that aren't working, you figure out why they're not working, and either you move away from it or you tweak it enough to get it to work. But it's a constant iteration, reiteration of processes to get it to progress. And that's true not only with processes in the company, but also with employees. It's a constant battle that you have to fight to move forward. And I think the evolution of a business design is only good to a certain point, and then it starts to break down. And so you have to recognize that the business that you have today is going to look different than the business you have tomorrow organizationally. If the company is 200 million today, and 2 to 3 years from now it's going to be 400 million, the design that we have today most likely is not going to work. There's not going to be enough layers of management. There's not going to be enough decision making. Some of the systems may have to be automated that aren't automated today, things like that.
What does that feel like for the CEO, Joe, if I can ask you to do a little bit of self-examination for a second? You've been there a long time. You've been through all these changes. You've been from zero to where you are now. Do you become a different person, or do you have different styles, or you discard things and pick up new things? Tell us a little bit about how that feels.
Well, I think it's all true. I think you evolve. You see what works. I've always said, and I've always said this to my own management team, is that I'm going to be CEO as long as I feel that I can progress the business forward. And if the business gets to a point where I'm not as effective because you need a different kind of leader, then I'm the first to say I'll step away. And I live those words. I managed the company for 17 years, and as the company approached 200 million, I promoted our COO, who had experience running $1 billion company, and it was time for me to go up to executive chairman and to be helpful to him, so he can institute and utilize the knowledge and experience he has in running a company that is 5 times the size of Medicus is now. And so
Yeah.
he's already been through all the landmines and how to avoid them, and he knows the things that need to get done. So I thought it was a real natural transition.
It's a key word, isn't it, Joe? Experience, which is, I think, learning by doing. It's you make mistakes and you then do something else. You find out what works and you do more of that. Would you add anything more to that word experience? Because it's pretty critical.
Well, I also think that it's important that somebody has rich enough experience. Like in the case where we promoted the COO, he already had experience running $1 billion company. So Medicus is his aspiration is to get to $1 billion. So in order to, so he's seen what it's going to take to get there.
Yeah. So you bring in experience that's been where you want to go.
Yes, and I think that's a
Yeah.
very important aspect.
Yeah. Great thought. So let's make our Austrian reference here. Joe, you mentioned a couple of Austrian concepts like consumer sovereignty and risk and uncertainty, and you're a great student of Austrian economics. Does that help you in your 17-year journey? What do you think are the elements of Austrian economics that have helped you the most?
Well, I first off think it's a logical and practical approach to the real world. That the thing that struck me about the Austrians at first was how logical it was, and then when you apply it in the real world, it actually makes sense. So unlike other schools of economics, when you have some of these models and they talk about perfect competition and you know it's nonsense because you look in the real world and you see that it doesn't exist. Where when the Austrians talk about entrepreneurship, when they talk about value, subjective value, that makes more sense to me. When you think about a product, you don't think about a product from what it cost and then how you determine the price. It's the other way around. It's what will consumers be willing to pay, that, and then you impute it backwards, and that's what gives value to something. And I think that that's oftentimes missing. I mean, tobacco only has value because there's people who want to smoke it. If for some reason, if 8 billion people decided that we don't want to smoke anything anymore, we don't want to smoke any tobacco products, the price of tobacco would be probably zero. I mean, there'd be no value to it because no one wants it. So these are insights that I find very instructive and very helpful in running a business, because just by thinking about the world and applying these concepts, you sort of can get to an answer. You have the construct to get to the right answer. And usually you do get to the right answer, or when you observe the world, you can explain it. Let's go back in the real world. Like when I thought about Medicus back in 2000, when I wrote that business plan in college, the one thing that was clear to me was that there was a massive shortage of doctors. And that was really an underpinning of the business, because if there's a shortage of doctors, when you compare that to the demand and what was happening 20 years ago, we were starting the early stages of the baby boomers retiring. So you don't even have to look at statistics, you kind of intuitively know the older you get, the more healthcare you require. Obviously, no question about it. So, as the workforce aged and as the baby boomers got older, and that's a huge chunk of America, you knew that the demand was going to be significant. Not to mention with the advent of pharmaceuticals and people living better, exercising, etc. The average people living to 80 years old, right? So, I mean, think about how crazy this is. In the 1970s, the government came in to protect old people, which were, quote, 40 years old, right? I mean, the 40-year-olds are a protected class. Tom Brady's playing in the Super Bowl 40 years old. In fact, he's probably more than 40 years old. So 40 years old in today's world is pretty young. I mean, Phil Mickelson, 51, I think, won a major tournament a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah.
So this idea that 40 was old in the 1970s, maybe 40 was old. Now 40 is actually quite young. But the point is that people living to 80, 90 years old, and they need more services. So we had this huge demand for services. You have a massive supply problem with doctors. Medicus solves that problem or helps alleviate that problem. So I said the basic tenets. Again, logically, I don't know the right answer. I'm not sure if this is going to work. I mean, I knew there was an industry that existed that's been around, but it was a very small niche industry. But I knew that all of these demographics were in our favor. And I said, look, we can do business in this space, and I think we can make money doing it.
Yeah. And then the strategy emerges as you actually do it. So we talk about entrepreneurship as action. It's not strategy, it's action, and then figuring out what works. I think you identified the market drivers, and then you created the firm drivers through innovation and so on.
That's right. I mean, I think ultimately you have to make an entrepreneur has to have this economic calculation. There has to be some type of assessment, and sometimes entrepreneurs are fabulously correct, right? Jeff Bezos. And then sometimes they're fabulously incorrect and they go bankrupt and they end up on the ash heap of history, and everybody in between. And I think, though, once you have the idea, it's about the doing, the execution of it. And then if you have the right mindset, if you're slightly wrong, you'll pivot and keep pivoting until you figure it out. If I want to own a restaurant and I think that, there's a need for pizza, I open it up. And if it turns out that there's too much competition, or if I don't make good enough pizzas, I pivot. I either make better pizzas, or maybe I integrate pasta and salads. So, I mean, we figure out how to create that value to bring those customers in through that feedback mechanism.
Yeah.
Even Zuckerberg, I mean, he could have never envisioned Facebook being what Facebook is today.
Right. And our economists use this word emergent, and it's one of those academic words that are sometimes difficult to understand exactly what it means. But I think you've described it. You start, you do something, and then you learn, and if necessary, you pivot, and then success emerges from that.
And you keep pivoting. Like even in our industry now, 20 years later, the industry now is very, very different. There's an emergence of technologies, third-party technologies. Then the question becomes, how do you utilize those technologies to advance your own business? I mean, if you think about, take Netflix as an example. Netflix only becomes available because other technologies had advanced and there was a confluence of technologies that made sense. What am I talking about? Bandwidth, compression software, everyone being connected, Wi-Fi or et cetera. So all of a sudden, all of these things happen, and then Netflix comes on, uses those technologies, adds to what they were doing, and then creates this beautiful streaming business that has now been further developed by Disney Plus and the rest of them.
Yeah, market drivers plus implementation. That's what we try and capture. So we're going to wrap it up there just for time, but you've been fabulously correct in your identification of the opportunity and then your implementation. So thank you for the time you've given us today, and congratulations on everything that you and Medicus have achieved.
Well, thanks, Hunter. I really do appreciate that, and I was happy to spend the time with you today.
Good. Thank you very much, Joe.
Okay, bye. Take care.
Economics for Business is a production of the Mises Institute. To explore more content like this, visit Mises.org. And for more from Hunter Hastings, visit hunterhastings.com.